Hi weaving friends, I hope you're doing really well. I'm just warping up a sampler and I came across something that I thought would be really helpful for some of you to know, so that's what I'm going to share with you today. This tutorial is brought to you by the Woe to Go Beginners Rigid Heddle class. This is one of my best-selling classes of all time, and it's not hard to see why. It is a step-by-step beginners class for rigid heddle weavers. Not only that, it's an excellent refresher for if your loom's been sitting away for a little time, or if you're just feeling like you're not learning and getting ahead with your loom. The class will take you through a placemat project that anyone can weave. You'll end up with a project that is beautiful and practical. I'll leave a link to the class down below so that you can pop over and have a read of all the positive reviews that have been left there. And who knows, it might just be the class for you. Now let's get on with the tutorial. So as you can see, I'm putting on a really short warp here. I'm warping from my stand and I've got my direct warping peg clamped to the table. And I'm warping with a thin cotton, an 8-2 cotton. I'm using a 12.5 dent reed, but the thing is, if I warped this 8-2 cotton just as a single in the 12.5 dent heddle, like I normally would for a normal plain weave, it's going to be extremely sparse. That is, the set is going to be so far apart that, you know, say if I held my fabric up, you'd be able to see through it. It'd be very gappy. And that's not the sort of fabric that I'm going for. I want something a little bit denser. So I am, to make things fairly straightforward, I'm doubling the warp threads. And so in my 12.5 dent heddle, I will now have a set of 25 because 12.5 times 2 is 25. So very simple way to double your set is just to double your warp threads. But there are two ways of actually warping your loom to double your warp threads. Both of them are completely valid, absolutely fine, and will work out just the same. But one way is a little bit quicker than the other. So first I'm going to tell you about the first method, and then I'll show you the second method. Method 1 would involve having 2 cones of the exact same yarn set up and ready to warp. You could either have them on a cone stand like I do, or you could set them up some other way so that they weren't falling over. By the way, if you want to know how to make one of these for much cheaper than a commercial version, I'll link to mine and my husband's tutorial down below. So basically, I would be joining these two together. I would be tying them onto the back apron rod together as well. Once I had tied the two together to this back apron rod, and you'll just have to imagine that I've done that because I've actually already started method 2. But imagine that these 2 threads are tied to the apron rod. I would just go to the first slot where I wanted to start and I would pull those 2 strands through, loop them around the peg, and then come back and do the same for the next slot. So then when you had finished warping all of the slots that you wanted warped, then you would go on to the threading step. And instead of threading 1 thread in every hole, you would be threading 2 in every hole and 2 in every slot. Now, as I said, this method works just fine, but it does take longer than method 2. So let me show you method 2 now. For method 2, I still use my cone stand or my warping stand. The only difference is this time I just have 1 cone of yarn that I want to use for the warp. Once I've tied on that single warp yarn to the back apron rod, I start threading in every hole and every slot. So naturally I'm going to first measure off the width of warp that I want to do. So I've done that already. I'm doing an 8 width warp and I've measured out 4 inches from the middle. So I'm going to go right to the middle and then I'll keep going to the other side, and I can either mark that or I can just measure it as I go. And so instead of bringing a couple of threads through every slot, we are just going to take 1 thread through every hole. Now what happens when we take that 1 thread through is it pulls up a loop, and it's not actually 1 thread anymore, it's 2 threads. So you can consider that a doubled thread in your hole. I take that to my warping peg, and then I come back to the back of the loom, take the yarn either over or under the apron rod, whichever point I'm up to, and then I can pop through the next slot. So basically I'm filling every hole and every slot with a thread or with a loop of thread. So that one was a slot. Now I'm going to go to the very next hole and pull that loop through, and voila, I have my doubled thread to take onto the warping peg. Now you might notice that I'm using the Ashford double-ended threading hook is what they call it. This is one of my favorite weaving tools. No, they didn't pay me to say this, it just really is. I found this so useful. I started out with a separate metal threading hook and a reed hook, and both of them were metal, and I just found them a real pain in the neck. The metal would split the thread, and I just didn't like having to use two tools. And this double-ended hook is fantastic for using this method, because what I can do is at this point I need to thread through a slot. So in one swift motion I can just change the hook to the reed hook end, which is the fat or the thick end, the big end. Take that thread through, and then as I come back, and I barely even have to think about it, I just swap to the threading hook to go through the hole. And it all ends up being a fairly swift motion to swap those over. So I will put a link to this double-ended hook in the notes below. If you ever can't find things that I've mentioned in a video down below, click on Show More to extend the drop-down menu. Okay, so let's have a look at how this looks from a little further away. So my last thread that I went through was a slot, so now I'm going through a hole, placing the loop on the peg, coming to the back, grabbing the thread and going through the slot. And this can get pretty fast once you've had a bit of practice at it. This is a really great technique for weaving kitchen towels in particular, because most of the time with kitchen towels you'll be using a thinner thread, and you'll often find that you need to double your warp, and this is just a really quick and easy way to do it. If you have any questions, anything that I've left out or forgotten to say, just leave them down below and I'll be happy to help you out. Now once you have finished threading to the widths that you want to do, you roll on your warp as normal, just as you normally would. But the big bonus here, besides only having to have one ball of yarn, besides saving time in this threading warping process, is what we're doing is we're slaying the heddle or the reed and threading it at the same time. So we've completely obliterated the threading step. So once you've rolled your warp on, you are good to go. You can tie on and get weaving and you don't have to do the threading step. That's a big bonus, I think. Well friends, I hope this video was a big help to you, and until next time, happy weaving.